For today's video, we are going to be talking a little bit about the early civil rights movement. We're going to be covering topics like school desegregation. We will also be looking at things like the Montgomery bus boycott. And with that, I think that one of the important places to start with this early civil rights movement is to talk about what's happened up until this point. So as far as Reconstruction, which is the first thing I have listed here, Reconstruction is that period that takes place at the end of the Civil War. So the Civil War has ended, and now there are questions about what should happen in the United States in regards to formerly enslaved African Americans. So with Reconstruction, it can really be sort of divided into two periods. The first period is going to be between 1865 and 1867. This period is known as Presidential Reconstruction, and it is going to be a period where President Johnson is going to really allow Southerners who were in power before the Civil War to come back into power. Now, of course, that means many different things, but one of the most long-lasting ramifications is that it means that people who had been in charge and who had been pushing for slavery and for secession from the Union are going to be back in power. They are going to institute what become known as black codes, and with these black codes, it's basically a method for them to continue to extract free or nearly free labor from African Americans. They are going to be denied the right to vote. They will have to sign labor contracts that they are not allowed to break. It's at this time that you can see the system of sharecropping, which will put not only African Americans but also poor whites in the South into a form of servitude where they are forced to continue working on the same piece of land in order to pay a debt over many years. And so with that particular part of Reconstruction, we can see some negative ideas starting to emerge that might also emerge later. After Presidential Reconstruction, by the time you get to 1867, just to give you a quick brief recap, Congress is going to take over. When Congress takes over, you have what is known as Radical or Congressional Reconstruction. During this era of Reconstruction, we see that for many African Americans, they are going to gain the right to vote. So many males will receive what we call the franchise, so they will be able to vote in elections. You also start to see that there are some African Americans who are even able to serve in local positions of government as well as in federal positions. So in Congress, we can see that there are African Americans in both the House of Representatives and in the Senate. Now, of course, we would not be talking about civil rights if things had actually gone, swimmingly well during this period. Unfortunately for the radical people as far as Reconstruction, the period does eventually come to an end. And when Reconstruction comes to an end in 1877, we will see that the Jim Crow South will start to rise. When we think about segregation and we think about the civil rights movement, we oftentimes think about the Jim Crow South. Now, with this, we can see that these are going to be laws that are placed on the South due to segregation and the people who were put into office. So with this, we will see different things like disfranchisement of African American males. Those who had maybe been able to vote in 1877 no longer able to vote. One way they are able to do this is going to, of course, be through things like a grandfather clause. So if your grandfather was able to vote before the Civil War, then you would also be able to vote. However, that pretty much excludes anyone who is an African American in the South. You also have different things like poll taxes, which would be applied to African Americans before they could vote, which most of the time the poll would be so astronomical for them that they wouldn't be able to meet that. We can also see they have the literacy tests, and we'll talk more about those in a future video. We'll actually look at one of those literacy tests. But with this, I think it's really important to also note that not only do you have segregation based on laws, but you also have terror groups like the KKK that start to arise in the South. And they are going to enforce segregation even outside of laws. So there might not be a specific law, for example, that says that an African American family can't move into a certain town. However, due to these terror groups and due to the use of terror tactics, an African American family who might attempt to move into a neighborhood might be sort of expelled. They might be pushed out of that neighborhood. So with that, we can see that the Jim Crow South is most certainly going to be segregated, and very blatantly so. I think it's also important for us to note, however, that de facto segregation is going to be something that exists in the North. We see that in many, many parts of the North, they are going to live very segregated lives, but it's not legal. With this de facto segregation, you can again see terror groups that do exist in different parts of the United States, even in different parts of the North. But we can also see that this de facto segregation, it exists even as far as restaurants. There might be certain restaurants that would not be deemed as safe for anyone who is not a white man or woman in the North. So what you're seeing now on your screen, this is actually a map that is going to show you the sort of rise of the Ku Klux Klan in the United States. This map starts in 1915 and then it continues until 1940. As you can see, there are many, many different sectors of the KKK that exist in different parts of the United States. And again, the reason I want to point this out is because segregation, whether it be by law in the South or whether it be de facto in the North, is something that definitely had a massive impact on the lives of African Americans and would have had a massive impact on where they move and how they are able to live their lives. One of the first moments where we can actually start to see people pressing against segregation, it's going to happen with the schools. So with school desegregation, we have to take it all the way back to 1857. In 1857, this is when you are going to have the decision of the Dred Scott case. Now, if you think back to what this Dred Scott case is, it does a couple of things. So it says that for Dred Scott, even though he was an enslaved man who was taken to a free state, that did not mean that he had his freedom. However, one of the most long-lasting impacts of this case is the fact that it says that anyone who's an African American, they are not full citizens. And effectively, it says that Dred Scott's not even supposed to be going to court. He's not supposed to be able to bring lawsuits to court and does not have full citizenship. With this, by the time you get to 1896, you will have the case of Plessy versus Ferguson. This is going to be a case that is going to establish the idea and the concept of separate but equal. Now, when it comes to schools, the idea that was put in place as far as separate but equal is that schools could be segregated so long as an equal and sort of equitable education would be realized for different groups of students. However, that most certainly was not the case. By the time you get to 1935, the NAACP, particularly under Thurgood Marshall, is going to begin its fight against school segregation. So when they start this fight against school segregation, they're really starting with graduate level schools and law schools. They know for a fact that if they are to get some sort of change, they have to start somewhere. Well, every member of the Supreme Court, most members of local courts, they've been to law school, so they know how law school works. They know the different important aspects of going to law school. Now, for any of you who are interested in law school or have been to law school, you know that one of the most important things you can do is to debate, to practice, to have mock trials. And you can't have mock trials and you can't have these debates if you're not able to do so, if you don't have any other students to do it with. For example, one of the cases that the NAACP is going to bring before the Supreme Court effectively states that in a situation where you have an African American student who has been segregated out of classes from white students, even if he's at the same university, if he's not able to engage in these mock trials and these debates, inherently his education is not going to be equal. So over the course of the 1930s into the 40s and 50s, we can see the NAACP again under Thurgood Marshall really starting at that higher level and pushing for desegregation. By the time you are able to get to May of 1954, this is where you are going to get Brown versus the Board of Education. With Brown versus the Board of Education, what is effectively happening is that by the time you get to 1851, there is a young girl, her father's name is Oliver Brown, and she wants to attend the white school that is much closer to her home. Instead, because of the color of her skin, she is forced to ride a bus across town to the African American school, which they find has far fewer resources, not quite as many teachers who are going to have the same degree of education. Again, they're not equal in the sense that, yes, they're both schools. Yes, you can get an education, but they are not actually fully equal. So with this, the case is going to work its way through the court system until it makes its way to the Supreme Court. With this, with Brown versus the Board of Education, what I have up here is the decision and the opinion of the decision, and this is going to be written by Chief Justice Warren, and he is going to deliver the opinion of the court. With this, it says that states where you do have segregation in schools are going to have to reverse this. They are not going to be allowed to continue to have segregated schools. Now with this, many different parts of the South, they say, oh, darn, we have to do that. However, they do it very, very slowly, or they put plans in place to start desegregating schools after decades. So with that, we can also see that eventually what is known as Brown 2 also has to be passed. And with Brown 2, that is where you are going to see the phrase, with all due diligence and speed, added into the decision, meaning that they have to do this a little bit more quickly. They can't continue to drag their feet when it comes to desegregation. Another early moment that I just quickly want to discuss when it comes to the civil rights movement is going to be the Montgomery bus boycott. With the Montgomery bus boycott, the face that you typically see associated with this movement is going to be Rosa Parks. Now, Rosa Parks was not necessarily the first person to refuse to give up her seat on a bus, even in Montgomery. For Rosa Parks, however, she does become the face. The first people who did, one of their names was Joanne Robinson, and at the time they weren't seen as being the ideal face. A lot of the women who refused were either young single mothers or they were unwed and pregnant, and at this point in American history, it would not have been as important of a movement if they had used women that were not seen as having a high reputation like Rosa Parks did. Now, for Rosa Parks, the idea here is that she is going to refuse to give up her seat. I have here for you a picture of Rosa Parks' mugshot. Now, with Rosa Parks and her mugshot, as this is going to be plastered all across the United States, people start to see it. And again, what they see is a woman who is potentially respectable. She looks like a working class woman, and she has refused to give up her seat. And with that, we can see that with the bus boycott, they are going to see the rise of Martin Luther King Jr. as well as a leader, and they're really focused in on this idea of nonviolence. The key here is that they do not want to have any sort of violent movements. Instead, you can see in the second picture that I have listed here, this idea of we are protesting injustices, people that are protesting, they want equality now, without having to use any type of violence. They're really taking a lot of notes from the apartheid system in South Africa, but with this, the rise of Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks will be very important. With the sit-in movement, we can see that in 1956, the Supreme Court will actually rule that the Montgomery bus segregation law is unconstitutional, and this will lead the way for other cities and for other states to also be forced to end segregation laws. So again, this was just a quick video to get you sort of oriented with the early civil rights movement. And with this early civil rights movement taking place in the 1950s, we will later see how it impacts the 1960s.